Hello, I'm Esther Githu-Yuat. Welcome to Africa 54. Here's what's coming up. Hundreds of people were killed or buried under rubble Thursday after a second Israeli airstrike on Gaza's largest refugee camp. U.S. President Joe Biden announces plans to remove 4 African countries from the AGOA partnership. And South Africa's Springboks kicks off a 4-day nationwide celebration and appreciation tour. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. Israel is under intense pressure to pause fighting in their war against Hamas for humanitarian reasons. U.S. and Arab mediators are intensifying their efforts to ease Israel's siege of Gaza and are calling for at least a brief halt to the hostilities in order to aid civilians. Hundreds of Palestinians with foreign passports and dozens of wounded were allowed to leave Gaza for the first time on Wednesday, and dozens more left on Thursday. The reopening of the Rafah border crossing on Thursday is facilitating the departure of more foreigners seeking to leave Gaza. Gaza officials have announced that approximately 7,500 foreign passport holders are to be evacuated over the course of about 2 weeks, according to a diplomatic source. At least 320 foreign citizens crossed into Egypt on Wednesday from an initial list of 500 individuals. Hundreds of people were killed or buried under rubble after 2 Israeli strikes on Gaza's largest refugee camp, according to Hamas. The armed wing of the Hamas says foreign hostages are among the dead. Diane Tor reports.
After 2 days of Israeli strikes on the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, Hamas said Thursday that hundreds of people were killed or buried under the rubble in attacks that UN rights officials said could amount to war crimes. The Israeli army released footage on Wednesday said to be of their military campaign by land, sea and air aimed at wiping out Hamas after its deadly rampage in southern Israel on October the 7th. Israel said its Tuesday and Wednesday strikes on Jabalia killed 2 Hamas military leaders, among other militants. On Thursday, Hamas said in a statement that at least 195 people were killed, with 120 missing under the rubble and nearly 800 wounded. Its armed wing earlier said 7 civilian hostages were killed in the Jabalia strikes, including 3 foreign passport holders. Reuters was unable to verify the casualty numbers, but satellite images show the extent of the damage in the area. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights voiced concern over civilian casualties in the strikes on Jabalia, which is Gaza's largest refugee camp, saying on social media, quote, "We have serious concerns that these are disproportionate attacks that could amount to war crimes." Meanwhile, more foreign nationals prepared to leave the besieged enclave on Thursday, as Gaza border officials said they would reopen the crossing to Egypt for them. More than 300 foreign citizens left on Wednesday under a deal between Israel, Egypt and Hamas, brokered by Qatar. Scores of severely injured Gazans were also allowed across the border for treatment. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will travel to Israel and Jordan on Friday to discuss updates on the conflict, according to State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller.
He will reiterate U.S. support for Israel's right to defend itself in accordance with international humanitarian law and discuss the need to take all precautions to minimize civilian casualties, as well as our work to deliver humanitarian assistance.
It comes amid mounting international calls for a humanitarian pause in hostilities as conditions in Gaza grow desperate under Israel's assault and tightened blockade.
Diane Tor of Reuters filed that report. The health ministry in Hamas-ruled Gaza says that more than 9,000 Palestinians have been killed in the war. Israeli officials say more than 1,400 of its citizens have been killed. The vast majority were civilians killed by Hamas during the initial October 7th attacks. For more on the war, I'm joined live from East Jerusalem by VOA correspondent Jan Bochert. Jan, update us on what's happening today.
Thank you, Esther. As Hamas announced Thursday that hundreds of people were killed or buried under rubble Thursday after a second Israeli airstrike on Gaza's largest refugee camp in Gaza, Good evening, Esther. Today was another bloody day, as it has been the last 25 days. More than 10,000 people were killed so far in this war, most of them, as you said, Palestinians. Today, also, Israel recognized that one battalion commander was killed in Gaza, and so far, 18 soldiers and commanders were killed since the ground invasion started. Earlier this evening, one rocket fell in central Israel, hit a house, but it seems nobody was hurt.
Yeah, and we're hearing more of the escalating violence, especially in the West Bank. What more are you learning?
Violence is escalating in the West Bank for the last 3 weeks. So far, 128 Palestinians were killed there, most of them by Israeli forces during raids into refugee camps, seeking for people linked to Hamas. But today, for the first time since the start of this war, a Jewish settler was killed in the West Bank by shooting. Someone shot at him while he was driving. So the violence is spreading all over the West Bank, and nobody knows what's going to happen in the next days or weeks.
As you mentioned there, Jan, Fridays are usually very tense days, especially during a war, in a place where there is war. What are the likely scenarios tomorrow? You are just hours away from getting into Friday.
I think we might see some protests, some of them violent in the West Bank, especially in Ramallah. Jenin and Nablus have been the scenario of a lot of raids, and a lot of people were killed there. There's a lot of tension about what's going to happen tomorrow, and the likely scenario is to have more protests and more violence in the West Bank.
And how are you feeling as a journalist, as you work with other international journalists there? How is your security?
Well, here where I am, I feel safe. It's different from Gaza, of course. In the West Bank, I feel safe as well. I have been well treated by the Israeli soldiers in the checkpoints. I have been well treated by the militant groups, the fighters that I met in the West Bank. So far, we journalists here in Israel and in the West Bank, we've not seen the same difficulties and casualties as we've seen in Gaza. More than 20 colleagues of us were killed already in Gaza, unfortunately.
Jan, thank you very much for your reporting. VOA correspondent Jan Bochat reporting live for us from East Jerusalem. Government officials from Washington, Moscow, Tehran and Ankara are weighing in on Israel's war against Hamas. VOA's Anita Powell has more from the White House.
The White House says it welcomes the limited flow of humanitarian aid and the restoration of telecommunications in Gaza as Israel continues its ground offensive on the enclave in response to militant group Hamas's October 7th attack. The Biden administration also is repeating its warning to armed groups to stay out of the fight.
Our message to any actor seeking to exploit this conflict is don't do it. And as you all know, we have strengthened our force posture in the region. We're continually watching to make sure that any actor who might be tempted to jump in here knows that we will take very seriously our national security interests in the region, not to mention our obligation to protect our troops and our facilities that are going after ISIS in places like Iraq and Syria.
But this conflict is also exploding in the court of public opinion. Hundreds of people stormed an airport in Russia's Dagestan region over the weekend, shouting anti-Semitic slurs over the arrival of a flight from Tel Aviv. Russia's president blamed the events on foreign interference, a move Kirby dismissed as classic Russian rhetoric.
The events in Makhachkala last night were inspired, including through social networks, not least from the territory of Ukraine, by the agents of Western intelligence services.
And Turkey's president has dug in on his disagreement with the U.S.'s classification of Hamas as a terror group and has shifted blame elsewhere.
The West has the biggest responsibility for the massacre in Gaza.
Iranian officials have piled on as well. That nation's foreign minister took to the rostrum at the United Nations last week to outline their view. Iranians have also protested on the streets.
It has been 3 weeks that we have been witness to the war crimes and genocide of the occupying Israeli regime in Gaza and the West Bank of Palestine. The United States and several European countries have sided with the occupying regime of Israel without observing the UN Charter and international law.
Kirby says the White House believes there's a fine line between disagreement and discord, and says the administration is vigilant over outbreaks of anti-Semitism.
No, we believe in the right of peaceful protest, even if it's, espousing ideas we don't agree with. But nobody wants to see peaceful protest turn violent or turn dangerous, the way that this mob activity did in Dagestan yesterday. So it's of concern, and it's something that we'll continue to talk about with our allies and partners.
But it's also something that increasingly the White House is facing at home, as protests, many supportive of Palestinians and critical of Israel, have bubbled up at major U.S. universities in recent weeks. Anita Powell, VOA News, the White House.
The conflict in Sudan between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary rapid support forces is in its 7th month with no signs of abating. VOA's Paul Ndiho has more.
The RSF has recently taken control of Nyara, Sudan's second largest city, leading to some optimism among residents that this may end the fighting. The death toll over the past 6 months of fighting has been devastating for the country, resulting in over 9,000 casualties and 5.6 million displaced people and refugees. The impact on Khartoum is immense, with widespread destruction and fragmentation, concerns arising from tension between opposing commanders. Army Chief Abdallah Fattah al-Burhani and former Deputy Commander Muhammad Hamdan Dagalo, who commands the RSF. To address the ongoing conflict, Sudan's army has agreed to send a delegation for talks with the RSF in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, to achieve at least a temporary halt to the fighting. The power struggle over the terms for a gradual transition from military to civilian rule is not only devastating for Khartoum, but it has also led to ethnically driven attacks in Darfur. Meanwhile, the United Arab Emirates is fending off accusations of supplying weapons to the RSF through the Central African Republic and Chad's Difog, a small town along the border with CAR, which is alleged to be a key area for their supply chain. The paramilitary rapid support forces are denying this allegation. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
Britain's King Charles and Queen Camilla visited Mombasa on Thursday, where they watched as Kenyan Marines staged a mock covert landing using techniques learned from the British Royal Marines. For more on today's activities, I'm joined live from Mombasa by reporter Josephat Kioko. Josephat, tell us about today's royal visit to the coastal city.
Oh, thanks so much, Esther, for having me on this show. The King was indeed in Mombasa for the past 8 or 10 hours, and he'll be here till tomorrow on Friday. And at the Nampo base, where the military has been receiving special training from the British Royal Marine, is when they launched a drill for the King. The drill was witnessed by the King, the Queen, and also the Kenyan president, who is also commander of the military in Kenya. And the drill was to demonstrate how they use the skills in ready for combating enemy and kind of attacks by landing on the sea or on the beach of the Indian Ocean, where the base is situated. And very many people are there, invited from the government, and also civilians were invited. And the security was very tight within Mombasa for the most part of this of Thursday, where the King was being received by the president.
Kioko, tell us how the Mombasa residents reacted to the royals' visit in the coastal city of Kenya. Usually Mombasa has a lot of people from all corners of Kenya, others coming out of, Tanzania. How was that? What was their reaction?
Esther, let me say there was a mixed reaction from Kenyans. There are those who are very happy to see the king first time coming to Africa as a king as first king, as a king coming to Africa for the first time and choosing Kenya as the first country to visit. Many were happy, although there are also others who are saying, in these hard economic times, why would he receive such visitors? Then they should join the president in bringing the economy of the country, and you could have seen how security was tight along the Mombasa streets, going all the way to the naval base in the area called Mutongwe, where the base is being trained sometimes by the British Royal Marines.
And do we know what is planned for tomorrow? They will still be in Mombasa. What are the activities planned for the royals tomorrow?
Yeah, the king had some time in this afternoon to visit some conservation units where people do conservation, others recycle plastic from the Indian Ocean, and that was an activity was planned for Thursday, and in Mombasa for another one day by Friday. He'll be staying in Mombasa, the coast region, and he said he loved this coast region because of the Navy base where he visited, because from the childhood he has been in association with the naval bases like the Royal Marines, where he's Captain General.
Josephat, many thanks for your reporting. Josephat Kioko live for us from Mombasa, Kenya. U.S. and African trade representatives are gathering in South Africa for their annual African Growth and Opportunity Act Forum. AGOA gives eligible African countries duty-free access to the U.S. market for most of the agricultural and manufactured products they export. U.S. President Joe Biden plans to drop 4 countries from the trade program: Uganda, Gabon, Niger, and the Central African Republic, for what the U.S. says is gross violations of human rights and failure to protect the rule of law. VOA's Haiti Adams spoke to U.S. trade and investment analyst Dennis Matanda about the impact of President Biden's decision.
AGOA does not have the heft that it ought to have, and especially because if you take AGOA away from a country that was making significant money from its cash crops, for example. Look, if you take AGOA away from a country like Uganda or Chad or Gabon, AGOA still has access to, or countries that export to the United States can still do GSP goods, the Generalized System of Preferences goods. They can still export coffee. Uganda's biggest export to the United States is coffee. I mean, biggest export anywhere, and they don't necessarily export to the United States. So from that perspective, AGOA needed, or the systems around AGOA need to be, you need to step away from the punitive aspects, because what you do every single time you take away AGOA benefits is you're punishing the small guy. You're not punishing the government. The government doesn't necessarily lose anything. The Ugandan government doesn't lose anything from AGOA. The Ugandan government or the Gabonese government, all these things are grappling with very serious things where the United States should not be intervening.
Do any of those changes come into play in terms of you have a deal, a trade deal that is, what now, 20 years old, over 20 years old, and you have a continent that has changed rapidly in the last 20 years. Is AGOA fit for the times?
Something is happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are fundamental elections that are going to happen. Congo is a huge country that has had peaceful elections. They were challenged, but they have another chance for these elections to be fundamental. AGOA should not be used. I know that the Democratic Republic of Congo and AGOA are not necessarily compatible in the same sentence. The point is that you don't need to be putting countries like that under any additional pressure. You don't need to be putting Gabon or Niger under any additional pressure.
That was Heidi Adams, VOA Straight Talk Africa, speaking to U.S. trade and investment analyst Dennis Matanda. As always, we're excited to hear what you think about Africa 54 and all our VOA Africa programs on our website at voaafrica.com. Still to come, South Africa's Springboks begin a nationwide celebration tour. We'll be right back.
According to IMF statistics and surveys, women in sub-Saharan Africa continue to struggle to secure corporate employment due to limitations such as education, gender discrimination, sexual harassment, and cultural norms. This week on Our Voices, we discuss a woman's journey to securing gainful employment in the formal sector and challenges they face, as well as possible solutions. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
In times of change, when the world seems uncertain and what we hear doesn't reflect what we see, we seek the truth. When we are told only part of the story, we lose trust. In moments of crisis, our dreams, hopes, and wishes for a better tomorrow depends on a free press. At Voice of America, we bring you the stories that people take risks to see. We connect the world and unite it with truth. At Voice of America, we show you the whole picture.
You are watching Africa 54 from the Voice of America headquarters here in Washington, D.C. In other news, Tunisians are angry over the escape from prison of 5 prisoners convicted of charges of terrorism. The Interior Ministry is calling for citizens to be vigilant following the inmates' escape from Managua prison at dawn on Tuesday, just outside Tunis. Among the escapees was Ahmed Al-Malik, who was serving 24 years following the killing of opposition figures, including Chokri Bilade. Human Rights Watch is calling on the United Nations and the international community to maintain pressure on the Ethiopian government to ensure justice for the victims of atrocities 1 year after the end of the Tigray War. The 2-year conflict in northern Ethiopia between the government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front killed 500,000 people, according to the U.S. And Ugandan authorities say they have captured the leader of a deadly militant group based in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo and blamed for killing 2 honeymooning foreign tourists and their local guide in a national park last month. A Briton and a South African were murdered in the attack on October 17th while on safari in Queen Elizabeth National Park. South Africa's Springboks kicked off its 4-day nationwide appreciation tour on Thursday as they celebrate their historic Rugby World Cup championship. VOA's Mike Hovey has that story.
The Springboks received a hero's welcome after thousands of South Africans flocked to O.R. Tambo International Airport in Johannesburg to greet the team. The celebrations continue as thousands of South Africans joined the team's 4-day appreciation tour across 5 provinces. Mandla Minga, a former rugby player and big fanatic of both finalists of the 2023 Rugby World Cup, says he was ecstatic when the Springboks made history in France.
I could not contain my emotions and feelings and everything once that final whistle was blown. That last 10 minutes, I clung onto my sister. I really just couldn't watch it. And as soon as that whistle went, I just opened up my eyes and I just celebrated.
Prior to the World Cup final, governing body World Rugby announced that the 2027 Rugby World Cup will be in Australia and will witness a historic participation of 24 teams. Minga says South Africa can execute a three-peat.
There's absolutely no reason as to why anybody should hate or look down on the Springboks or their ability. And if you look at it, the support that we have from the development levels, from school levels to club levels. So I think within South Africa, the growth trajectory within the rugby space is well sought after.
Several members of the Springboks are in the prime of their careers, between 29 and 32 years old. Some commentators doubt that the team will look the same in 2027. Zugile Ngube, a commentator and former rugby player who was based in Japan, says South Africa's investment in rugby allows them to produce talent that can continue the culture of winning.
There are guys who didn't play. Andre Pollard, he's only 29, so he's actually could potentially be the scrum halves. As I mentioned, we have 2 guys.
Ngube says, like South Africa, other African nations should heavily invest in rugby to ensure that they participate and stand out at the tournament in 2027. Ngube's sentiments were echoed by Herbert Mensah, the president of Rugby Africa.
Sports these days is a professional issue. It's no longer the old Olympic charter of just participating. And therefore, there needs to be investment. And the investment does, as you rightly say, start at grassroots level and then moves right the way through.
Rugby Africa is working tirelessly to ensure that the sport grows on the continent. The governing body facilitates several tournaments that is spiking interest in Africa, predominantly in Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Nigeria, and Morocco. Mike Ove, VOA News, Washington.
And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.
Watching VOA's Red Carpet. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. Thank you so much for joining us each week right here on Red Carpet. We bring you the latest in